An elderly black couple trembles as police officers tower over them, hurling racial slurs in a crowded diner. The restaurant falls silent until the door swings open, revealing a towering figure in military dress blues. The officers' smug expressions dissolve into shock when they recognize who just arrived. Before we dive into this powerful story of justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If this kind of real talk about racial justice matters to you, hit that like button and subscribe now to join our community fighting for change. Ready to see what happens when silence is no longer an option. Eleanor and Walter Johnson had been married for 51 years, and for 45 of those years they had lived in Mapleton, Georgia, a town that wore its history like an old coat, comfortable for some, suffocating for others. Every Sunday morning for the past 20 years, they followed the same ritual wake at 6:30, dress in their Sunday best, attend the 7:30 service at New Hope Baptist Church, and then enjoy breakfast at Rosie's Diner before returning home. Eleanor took particular pride in their appearance, especially on Sundays. This morning she had selected her powder blue dress with pearl buttons and matching hat, while Walter wore his navy suit with the American flag pin on the lapel, a small reminder of his service in Vietnam. As Walter adjusted his tie in the mirror, Eleanor noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Your arthritis bothering you today?" she asked, coming up behind him to help smooth his collar. Walter shook his head. "Just the usual, nothing I can't handle." But Eleanor knew better. Her husband of over 5 decades carried more than just physical pain. As a young man of 22, Walter had left Mapleton with dreams of proving himself, of showing that a black man could serve his country with honor and return to respect. Vietnam had taken his youth, shattered his knee, and left him with nightmares that still woke him 50 years later. But it was coming home that had broken something deeper inside him. Eleanor still remembered the day he returned, how the same bus station where white soldiers were greeted with parades had no welcome for the black veterans. How the job opportunities promised to returning servicemen mysteriously disappeared when Walter applied. How the GI Bill that helped his white counterparts buy homes somehow couldn't overcome the neighborhood restrictions when they tried to move out of the historically black section of town. Despite it all, they had built a life here. Eleanor had become the first black elementary school teacher in the district, breaking barriers with quiet determination until she retired 15 years ago. Together, they had raised their son Marcus to believe in justice, in the promise of what America could be, even when it failed to live up to that promise. Now at 39, Marcus was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Johnson, a decorated Marine with multiple combat tours and a position that filled them with equal parts pride and worry. His most recent deployment had him stationed overseas, though his letters mentioned he might be returning to the States soon for an instructor position. As Walter finished dressing, Eleanor handed him his heart medication and watched him take it with a glass of water. "Did you see the photos Marcus sent last week?" she asked, trying to lighten his mood. Walter's face softened at the mention of their son. "That boy makes that uniform look good, doesn't he? Gets that from his daddy?" Eleanor laughed, the sound warming their modest but immaculate home. "Oh, is that right? I seem to recall a certain someone looking quite handsome in his uniform back in the day." Walter pulled her close for a gentle kiss. "Still got it, don't I?" They shared a laugh as they gathered their things and headed for the car. Walter insisted on driving, though his knee made it uncomfortable. Eleanor knew better than to suggest otherwise. A man's dignity was nothing to trifle with, especially when so much had been taken already. As they drove through town in their carefully maintained 10-year-old Buick, Eleanor noticed the subtle changes in Walter's demeanor. His shoulders tensed as they passed the police station. His jaw tightened when they stopped at a light next to Officer Reynolds's personal truck with its oversized tires and Confederate flag license plate holder. Eleanor reached over and placed her hand on his, a gesture that had carried them through countless moments like this. Mapleton had changed over the decades or so, the town leaders claimed at every opportunity. The explicitly segregated facilities were gone, replaced by implicit boundaries that everyone understood but no one acknowledged. The racial slurs once shouted openly were now whispered behind closed doors or coded in phrases like "those people" and "urban elements." Progress, they called it. Walter pulled into Rosie's parking lot at precisely 9:15 as he did every Sunday. The diner had been a Mapleton institution since the 60s, and while it had once refused to serve black customers, it had been one of the first establishments to integrate when forced by law. Now it served everyone, though certain patterns remained visible to those who knew to look. As they stepped inside, the bell above the door announced their arrival. Stacy, a waitress in her 30s who had been serving them for years, looked up with a genuine smile. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Several regular customers nodded in greeting, while others suddenly became very interested in their menus or coffee cups. Tom, the manager, glanced up from behind the counter with the tight smile he reserved for customers he served out of obligation rather than welcome. "Your booth is occupied today," he said, though Eleanor could clearly see their usual spot by the window sitting empty. "Stacy will seat you by the kitchen." Walter's hand tightened slightly around Eleanor's, but his expression remained dignified. "That'll be just fine," he said, his voice betraying none of the resignation Eleanor knew he felt. This, too, was part of their Sunday ritual, the small indignities, the subtle reminders of their place, and the dignity with which they refused to let it diminish them. The table near the kitchen was never anyone's first choice at Rosie's. The constant swinging of the doors sent bursts of hot air and cooking smells washing over diners, while the clatter of dishes and shouts from the cook created a backdrop that made conversation difficult. Yet Eleanor and Walter settled into their seats with practiced grace, as though they had chosen this spot themselves. Stacy approached with menus and an apologetic smile. "Coffee's fresh this morning," she said, placing 2 mugs on the table. "And Jessie made those blueberry muffins you like, Mrs. Johnson." Eleanor thanked her warmly, noticing how Stacy's eyes darted toward the manager's back before she leaned in slightly. "I saved one for you special," she whispered as she placed a slightly larger muffin on Eleanor's bread plate. These small acts of kindness were treasures Eleanor collected carefully, reminders that humanity persisted even in unwelcoming spaces. Around them, the Sunday morning crowd represented a cross-section of Mapleton. By the front window sat an elderly white couple, the Petersons, who had run the hardware store for decades. Mrs. Peterson occasionally exchanged church pleasantries with Eleanor, while Mr. Peterson maintained a polite distance that neither acknowledged nor challenged the town's unspoken boundaries. In a corner booth, a young interracial couple spoke in hushed tones, their fingers intertwined on the table, but quickly separating whenever the bell above the door rang. Eleanor had noticed them before, the young black man always scanning the room, as though mapping escape routes, the white woman with determination in her eyes and tension in her shoulders. They were pioneers of a sort, testing whether Mapleton's claims of progress extended to matters of the heart. The bell above the door chimed, drawing everyone's attention. Chief Bradley Reynolds entered first, his substantial frame filling the doorway before he stepped aside to let Officer Justin Mercer follow. At 58, Reynolds had been with the Mapleton Police Department for 34 years, the last 15 as chief. His close, cropped gray hair and perpetual scowl had become symbols of authority in the small town, his reputation built on what he called old-school policing and what others might call selective enforcement. Walter had known Reynolds since high school, where Bradley had been the type of boy who found his power in others' fear. That boy had grown into a man with a badge and gun, his teenage cruelty refined into something more controlled, but no less toxic. Officer Mercer, at 34, represented the next generation. Once the star quarterback who had taken Mapleton High to the state championship, he had returned after a failed attempt at college football and joined the force under Reynolds's mentorship. Some in the black community had initially hoped Mercer might bring new perspectives, but those hopes faded as he adopted his mentor's attitudes and approaches. Reynolds's gaze swept the diner before landing on Walter and Eleanor. A smile that didn't reach his eyes spread across his face as he nudged Mercer, tilting his head in the Johnsons' direction. With deliberate casualness, the officers chose a table close to the Johnsons, positioning themselves so that Walter would have to look at them while eating. Eleanor felt her husband's foot press gently against hers beneath the table, their silent code for ignore and endure. They had perfected the art of pretending not to hear over decades of practice. Still, there was no missing Reynolds's voice intentionally pitched to Carrie. "Interesting crowd today, isn't it, Mercer? Didn't think certain folks could afford the prices here." Mercer chuckled on cue. "Maybe they're celebrating something special. Anniversary of their first welfare check." Walter's coffee cup clicked against the saucer as he set it down with precise control. Eleanor began discussing their granddaughter's recent school award, speaking just loudly enough to create a bubble of conversation around them. For several minutes, this delicate balance held each party pretending the other didn't exist, while hyper-aware of every movement. Then Walter's elbow bumped his coffee cup as he reached for the sugar, sending a small amount spilling onto the table. Before Eleanor could reach for a napkin, Reynolds was on his feet, moving toward their table with the exaggerated helpfulness that signaled trouble. "Well, now looks like we've got a situation here," he said, looming over their table. "Need some assistance, old-timer?" Walter looked up, his face a careful mask. "No thank you, officer, just a small spill." Reynolds ignored him, turning to call across the diner. "Tom might want to check if these folks can handle their dishes properly. Wouldn't want any valuable property damaged." The manager appeared with a cloth, his tight smile now a grimace. "It's fine, Chief. Just a little coffee." Reynolds placed a heavy hand on Walter's shoulder. "You doing all right today? Johnson, hands seem a bit shaky. Not drinking before church, are you?" Eleanor intervened smoothly. "My husband doesn't drink, Chief Reynolds. As you well know, he has some arthritis, that's all." Reynolds turned his attention to her, his eyes cold. "Didn't ask you, Mrs. Johnson. Was having a man-to-man with your husband here." He turned back to Walter. "You still got that old Buick Saw car matching that description near the convenience store that was robbed last night." The accusation was so absurd it might have been laughable in another context. Walter, a 73-year-old retired postal worker with a bad knee, robbing a convenience store, but no one was laughing. The diner had grown quiet, other conversations suspended as people pretended not to listen while missing nothing. Walter's voice remained steady. "We were home all evening, Chief, as we are most evenings." "Is that right?" Reynolds signaled to Mercer, who had now joined them. "Funny thing about memory. Gets unreliable at a certain age. Maybe you thought you were home, but actually went for a little drive." Stacy approached with the coffee pot, her intervention transparent but brave. "Can I warm up anyone's coffee?" Reynolds waved her away. "We're conducting police business here, Stacy. Why don't you see to your other tables?" From across the diner, Eleanor could feel the young interracial couple watching intently. The woman seemed to be urging the man to do something while he shook his head slightly, his eyes communicating something Eleanor understood all too well. Not now. Not here. It never was the right time or place. That was how towns like Mapleton maintained their equilibrium, by ensuring confrontation always carried a cost too high to bear. As Reynolds continued his veiled accusations, Eleanor noticed Mrs. Peterson watching with troubled eyes, while her husband studied his eggs with sudden fascination. Tom hovered nearby, clearly torn between his desire to avoid trouble with the police and his business interest in not having a scene. And so the fragile Sunday morning peace fractured along familiar lines, with the weight of history pressing down on a simple breakfast in a small-town diner. "ID, both of you." Reynolds' tone shifted from mock politeness to direct command, his hand extending expectantly toward Walter. "Let's see some identification right now." Eleanor glanced around the diner, noting how several patrons suddenly found their meals fascinating, while others watched with undisguised interest. She reached for her purse, but Walter placed his hand gently on her arm. "May I ask why you need our identification, Chief Reynolds? We're just having our Sunday breakfast as we do every week." Reynolds leaned closer, his bulk casting a shadow across their table. "Because I'm the chief of police and I said so. That's reason enough in this town." The implication was clear, and Mapleton Reynolds's authority needed no justification, particularly when exercised against black residents. Mercer positioned himself at the edge of the table, hand resting casually near his holster, a posture that communicated threat while maintaining plausible deniability. "Sir, there's been reports of individuals matching your description in an area they don't belong. Routine check, that's all." The younger officer's tone attempted professionalism, but the smirk undermined it. Walter slowly reached for his wallet movements, deliberate to avoid any misinterpretation. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor could see the young interracial couple having an intense, whispered conversation. The woman appeared to be insisting on something, while the man kept shaking his head, fear evident even from across the room. How many times had Eleanor seen that same exchange play out? How many people had wrestled with the choice between speaking up and self-preservation? Walter handed his driver's license to Reynolds, who made a show of examining it closely. "Walter Johnson, 724 Oak Street. That's over in the east side, isn't it? Quite a drive just for breakfast." Everyone in the diner knew exactly where Oak Street was located. The east side had been Mapleton's black neighborhood since the town's founding, originally by force of law, now by economic reality and unspoken understanding. "And what brings you to this particular establishment? There's plenty of places closer to your home." Eleanor handed her ID to Mercer while answering calmly. "We've been coming to Rosie's after church for 20 years, Chief Reynolds, as you're well aware." Reynolds ignored her, focusing on Walter. "Had any visitors lately? Any unusual activity in your neighborhood?" Walter's hand trembled slightly, though whether from age or suppressed anger, Eleanor couldn't tell. Inside, she felt her own anger building, a familiar heat that she had spent a lifetime controlling. At 73, Eleanor had lived through segregated schools, whites-only water fountains, and being called "girl" by white children. She had endured decades of having to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified. She had watched her husband return from serving his country only to be treated as less than a citizen. And now, in what should have been their golden years, they still couldn't enjoy a simple breakfast without harassment. Reynolds deliberately placed his coffee cup on the edge of their table, then knocked it over with a slight movement of his elbow. Coffee splashed across the table and onto Walter's suit pants. "Well, look at that," Reynolds said with mock concern. "Seems like we're all having accidents today." He turned to Mercer. "Clumsy of me, wasn't it, officer?" Mercer chuckled obediently. "Very clumsy, Chief." Walter sat perfectly still as the hot liquid soaked through to his skin. His eyes, normally warm and expressive, had gone distant, and Eleanor recognized the look. He was back in another time, another confrontation. During the Civil Rights Movement, Walter had participated in a lunch counter sit-in at this very diner. He had been 20 years old, full of hope that change was coming. The owner at that time had poured hot coffee on the protesters while local police watched amused. 53 years later, and here they were again. Eleanor grabbed napkins and began blotting Walter's pants, her movements efficient, but her hands shaking with emotion. "That's enough," she said quietly but firmly. "We've done nothing wrong, and you know it." Reynolds's face hardened. "Careful, Mrs. Johnson. Interfering with police business is a crime. Wouldn't want to see a respected retired teacher taken downtown, would we?" Stacy approached again, more napkins in hand. "I'll get a towel from the back," she offered. Tom quickly intercepted her. "Don't bother the officers, Stacy. They're just doing their job." From across the diner, Eleanor heard a chair scrape as someone stood up. "This is ridiculous," a young woman's voice said clearly. It was the white woman from the interracial couple. Her partner grabbed her wrist, his expression pleading. "Jamie, don't," he whispered loudly enough to be heard. "It's not worth it." "Not worth it," she responded, though she did sit back down. "How is this not worth it?" Reynolds smiled, enjoying the tension he had created. "Seems like your type of breakfast spot is attracting all sorts now, Tom. Might want to consider your clientele before your regulars find somewhere else to go." He turned back to Walter. Speaking of going places, maybe we should continue this conversation at the station. I've got some questions about your movements last night, and I'm not sure a public venue is appropriate." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. She had heard too many stories of elderly black men who entered police custody in good health, only to emerge injured or worse. Some didn't emerge at all. "Our son," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "our son would want to know if you're taking his father in for questioning." Reynolds laughed. "Ah, yes, the famous military son. Always talking about him, aren't you, Lieutenant Colonel? Isn't that what you tell everyone? Funny how we never see this decorated hero around town." Walter's head snapped up, his distant expression replaced by a flash of anger. "Don't you speak about my son. Marcus served 3 combat tours while you were giving speeding tickets and harassing black folks in Mapleton." The diner went completely silent. In all their years of enduring Reynolds's petty tyranny, Walter had never responded directly to provocation. The chief's face darkened with anger. "Sounds like disrespecting an officer to me. Stand up, Johnson." Walter gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Reynolds's hand moved to his holster. "Stand up now, or I'll assist you up." Eleanor felt terror grip her heart as she saw the situation spiraling towards something unthinkable. Walter, with great difficulty due to his bad knee, began to rise from his seat, his dignity intact despite the coffee stain spreading across his pants. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice carrying through the silent diner. "I watched good men die for the freedom you're denying me right now." Reynolds stepped closer, his hand still on his weapon. "Your service doesn't put you above the law, old man." Walter stood at his full height, still impressive despite his years. "And your badge doesn't put you above decency. Do you believe there are still places in America where people face this kind of discrimination just because of their skin color?" Comment number 1, if you think racial profiling by police is still a serious problem. Or comment number 2, if you think incidents like this are isolated. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of race. Subscribe to hear more stories that shine a light on social justice issues that need our attention. What do you think will happen next? Will Walter be arrested, or will someone intervene before this situation gets even worse? The tension in Rosie's diner crackled like electricity before a storm. Reynolds had moved into Walter's personal space, using his bulk to intimidate the elderly man who refused to be cowed. Eleanor stood beside her husband, her hand on his arm, torn between fear for his safety and pride in his dignity. The other diners watched in frozen silence, witnesses to a scene that would later be described in very different ways depending on who was telling the story. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the tension. Every head turned as a towering figure stepped into the diner, momentarily silhouetted against the morning sunlight. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Johnson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his Marine Corps dress blues, immaculate medals and ribbons gleaming on his broad chest. At 39, he had the powerful build of a man who maintained peak physical condition as both requirement and personal discipline. His close-cropped hair and clean-shaven face accentuated features that combined Eleanor's elegance with Walter's strength. Marcus took in the scene before him with the rapid assessment of a man trained to evaluate threats in combat zones. His eyes moved from his parents to the officers, noting Reynolds' aggressive posture and Mercer's hand hovering near his weapon. Without hurry, he closed the door behind him and moved with military precision toward the confrontation. The diner remained absolutely silent as he approached. Reynolds didn't immediately register the newcomer, still focused on Walter. "I'm going to give you one more chance to cooperate, Johnson, before we do this the hard way." "I believe my father has cooperated fully, Chief Reynolds," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "Perhaps you could explain why you're threatening an elderly veteran in a public establishment." Reynolds turned irritation at the interruption clear on his face until recognition dawned. The change in his expression would have been comical in another situation, shifting from arrogant authority to uncertainty in an instant. "Marcus Johnson, he said, attempting to regain his composure. "Didn't know you were back in town." Marcus positioned himself strategically, placing his body between his parents and the officers without making it obvious. "Just arrived. Fortunate timing, it seems." He turned to his parents, his formal demeanor softening slightly. "Mom, Dad, are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, relief visible on her face, while Walter simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, communicating volumes in that single touch. Marcus returned his attention to the officers, maintaining perfect military bearing. "Officer Mercer, it's been some time. Still following the chief's lead, I see." Mercer shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very conscious of his sloppy uniform compared to Marcus's pristine appearance. "Just doing our job, Colonel." "Lieutenant Colonel," Marcus corrected mildly. "And I'd be interested to hear exactly what job requires harassing my parents during their Sunday breakfast." He withdrew his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. "I'm recording this conversation now for everyone's clarity. I'd appreciate hearing the specific legal basis for this interaction." Reynolds's face flushed with anger, but years of bullying weaker opponents had not prepared him for confronting someone with greater authority and presence than himself. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Standard procedure to question potential witnesses." Marcus nodded as though considering this seriously. "I see. And could you cite the specific statute that allows you to demand identification from citizens who are not suspected of committing a crime? I'm particularly interested since Mapleton PD has been the subject of several complaints regarding selective enforcement patterns." Reynolds blinked, caught off guard by Marcus's knowledge. "You've been gone a long time, Marcus. Don't come back thinking you know how things work here." "On the contrary," Marcus replied, his voice remaining respectful but unyielding. "I've been very well informed about how things work here. That's precisely why I requested reassignment to Fort Benning as an instructor." He glanced around the diner, noting the rapt attention of every patron. "I'll be stationed just 90 minutes away now, close enough to visit regularly." The implication was clear. Marcus's presence in Mapleton would no longer be a rare occurrence. Reynolds attempted to regain control of the situation. "This doesn't concern you, Marcus. This is police business." Marcus smiled slightly. "It became my concern when you targeted my parents. And as for police business, I've spent the last 18 months working with the Military Justice Division on compliance with civilian law enforcement standards. I'm quite familiar with proper police procedure, which is why I'm troubled by what I'm observing here." He turned to address Officer Mercer directly. "For instance, officer, are you aware that Georgia Code Section 17-4-20 specifically prohibits law enforcement from demanding identification without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity?" Mercer glanced at Reynolds, clearly uncertain how to respond. Marcus continued, "I'm also curious about the departmental policy regarding harassment based on race, which I believe violates both federal civil rights law and the department's own published standards of conduct." He turned back to Reynolds. "Perhaps you could provide your badge number and the name of your supervising authority. I'd like to include that in my documentation." Reynolds' face had turned from red to purple. "You come back here with your fancy uniform and legal talk, thinking you can change how things are done. This is my town, boy. Don't forget that." The racial slur hung in the air, spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "That statement is now part of the official record, Chief Reynolds, and for clarity, Mapleton belongs to all its citizens, including those you've systematically harassed for decades." He turned to address the diner at large. "Would anyone who witnessed this interaction be willing to provide contact information for potential statements? Civil rights violations typically benefit from multiple perspectives." To Reynolds' visible shock, several hands went up immediately. The young interracial couple stood up together. The white woman spoke first. "I recorded most of it on my phone. Been documenting incidents like this for months for my graduate thesis on rural policing disparities." Her partner added, "I'd be happy to provide a statement as well." Reynolds looked around, seemingly noticing for the first time that the diner's patrons weren't all on his side. Marcus turned his attention back to his parents. Mom. Dad, I believe your breakfast has been interrupted. Perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere. Eleanor, still processing her son's unexpected arrival, found her voice. Marcus, when did you get back? We thought you were still overseas. Marcus smiled, genuine warmth breaking through his professional demeanor. Arrived stateside last week. Was going to surprise you today, though. Not quite like this. He turned back to the officers. Chief Reynolds, Officer Mercer. I believe we've established that my parents have broken no laws and are free to go, unless you're prepared to make a formal arrest with stated probable cause, in which case I'll need to contact our family attorney immediately. Reynolds, realizing he had lost control of the situation, attempted to save face. We were just finishing up here anyway. Got actual police work to do. He started to walk away, then turned back with a forced smile that resembled a grimace. Welcome home, Marcus. Hope you enjoy your stay in Mapleton. The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. Marcus nodded politely. I intend to, Chief. In fact, I've been corresponding with several federal colleagues who are quite interested in visiting Mapleton as well. They're particularly curious about some patterns that have emerged in local law enforcement statistics. Reynolds's radio crackled to life, saving him from having to respond. The dispatcher's voice came through clearly. Chief, please return to the station immediately. County officials are on the line regarding an urgent matter. Reynolds and Mercer exchanged glances. We need to go, Reynolds said curtly, then strode toward the door with Mercer following close behind. As they left, Marcus returned to his parents, his formal demeanor giving way to genuine concern. Are you both really okay? He asked, embracing his mother and gripping his father's shoulder. Eleanor felt tears threatening. We are now, she said softly. But Marcus, what did you mean about corresponding with federal colleagues? And how did you know what was happening here? Walter studied his son with a mixture of pride and curiosity. You've been planning something, haven't you, son? Marcus nodded, his expression serious. Let's just say my return isn't entirely coincidental. We have a lot to discuss, but not here. He looked up as Stacy approached with fresh coffee. Ma'am, I apologize for the disruption. Would it be possible to get my parents' breakfast to go? I think they've had enough public dining for one day. As Stacy hurried to comply, the young interracial couple approached. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, the woman said. I'm Jamie Chen, sociology doctoral candidate at Georgia State. This is my fiancée, Darnell Washington. We've been documenting cases like your parents for my dissertation. Would you have time to talk later? Marcus shook their hands. I'd be very interested in your research, Ms. Chen, Mr. Washington. I believe we may have complementary objectives. As they exchanged contact information, Eleanor noticed something she hadn't seen in Rosie's diner, before people of different races openly acknowledging each other, united by what they had just witnessed. The invisible barriers that had divided the space for decades seemed momentarily permeable. And at the center of it all stood her son, somehow, both the boy she had raised and a powerful man she was still getting to know. Walter leaned close to her ear. Our boy came home, Ellie, he whispered, and he came ready for battle. Marcus stood at the center of Rosie's diner with the composure of a man accustomed to command, yet the gentle way he helped his father into his coat revealed the sun beneath the uniform. Before we leave, he addressed the room at large, I want to be transparent about what just happened here. My parents, like many black citizens in Mapleton, have endured systematic harassment for decades. Today you all witnessed a small sample of that reality. His voice carried without shouting a skill developed over years of military leadership. If anyone else has experienced or witnessed similar treatment and would like to contribute to the documentation effort, I'm collecting statements as part of a broader investigation. He produced business cards and placed them on a nearby table. My contact information. All communications will be treated with appropriate confidentiality. The young couple, Jamie Chen and Darnell Washington, immediately approached. We've been gathering evidence for months, Jamie said, her academic demeanor giving way to passionate advocacy. I have video documentation of 17 separate incidents of racial profiling by Mapleton PD in just the last semester. Darnell nodded. Most people are too afraid to speak up, but we've been building trust in the community. We have statements from over 30 residents. Marcus appeared genuinely impressed. That's excellent work. I'd like to compare your findings with what I've been collecting. He turned to address several other diners who had approached. If you're comfortable providing contact information, we can arrange formal interviews later this week. Eleanor watched in amazement as people she had seen in this diner for years but never spoken to began writing their names and numbers on napkins and receipt backs. Even more surprising, Mrs. Peterson, the elderly white woman who had always been politely distant, approached with determination. "Young man, I've lived in this town for 67 years, and what I saw today made me ashamed. It's not the first time either." Her husband joined her, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Bradley Reynolds has been operating like a law unto himself for too long. When he was just a patrol officer, he pulled our son over every time he drove through town with his black college roommate. That was 20 years ago, and nothing's changed." The dam had broken. A middle-aged black woman introduced herself as a nurse at the local hospital. They target black medical staff driving home on night shifts, always claim it's routine checks, but it only happens to us. As more people began sharing experiences, Tom, the manager, hovered anxiously nearby. "Please," he interjected, "this is a family establishment. Maybe take this conversation elsewhere." Marcus turned to him with polite firmness. "Sir, with respect, pretending these issues don't exist hasn't served this community well. However, we're just about to leave." He addressed the growing group. "My parents need some rest after this ordeal. For anyone willing to provide formal statements, I'll be setting up at the community center on Oak Street tomorrow afternoon." He paused, then added, "And for those concerned about potential retaliation, I want to be clear I'm not operating alone. The pattern of civil rights violations in Mapleton has attracted attention from federal authorities." Reynolds's earlier dismissal of Marcus's military position suddenly looked like a serious miscalculation. As if on cue, the diner door opened again, revealing a striking black woman in her late 30s, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a leather portfolio. "Lieutenant Colonel Johnson," she said professionally. "I was informed there was an incident." Marcus nodded. "Attorney Washington, thank you for coming so quickly. May I introduce my parents, Walter and Eleanor Johnson?" The woman shook their hands warmly. "Ayanna Washington, civil rights attorney. I've been consulting with your son for several months now. It's an honor to meet you both." Walter looked between the attorney and his son with dawning comprehension. "Several months, son. How long have you been planning this?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Let's just say I've been putting my intelligence training to good use. The systematic civil rights violations in Mapleton needed documentation before action could be taken." Eleanor felt a mix of pride and concern. "Marcus, is this why you requested the transfer to Fort Benning?" He nodded. "Partly. I've been working with Attorney Washington and federal contacts to build a comprehensive case." Ayanna Washington opened her portfolio. "What happened here today isn't isolated. We've documented over 70 incidents of racial profiling, selective enforcement, and civil rights violations by the Mapleton Police Department in the past 18 months alone." She looked around the diner. "And based on what I'm seeing, we may have several new witnesses willing to come forward." Tom approached again, more insistent. "Please, this is disrupting my business. I'm going to have to ask you to take this outside." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Of course. We've taken enough of everyone's time." As they prepared to leave Stacy, the waitress approached Marcus and handed him a folded napkin. "My number," she said quietly. "I've seen how they treat black customers for years. I have documentation, too. Notes of incidents, dates, names." The manager called sharply from across the room. "Stacy, table 6 needs service." She hurried away, but not before giving Marcus a meaningful look. Outside in the parking lot, they found a small crowd gathering. News traveled fast in Mapleton. Even more surprising were the 2 news vans pulling up logos identifying them as stations from the nearby city. A young reporter approached with a microphone. "Lieutenant Colonel Johnson." We received an anonymous tip about a confrontation between police and elderly citizens. Would you care to comment?" Marcus exchanged glances with Attorney Washington, who nodded slightly. "I'd be happy to provide a statement," he said, positioning himself so that his parents were visible but not directly in the spotlight. "What you're seeing is the beginning of a long overdue reckoning in Mapleton. For decades, systemic discrimination has been enforced by those sworn to protect all citizens equally. Today, my parents, both in their 70s, were harassed by police while simply having breakfast after church." The reporter looked genuinely interested rather than simply seeking a sensational clip. "And you're saying this is part of a pattern, a well-documented pattern," Attorney Washington interjected. "We've been building a case for federal civil rights intervention for months. Today's incident, witnessed by dozens and recorded on multiple devices, is just the latest example." Eleanor watched her son handle the media with the same composed authority he had shown inside. This was a Marcus she hadn't seen before, a strategic thinker orchestrating a complex operation. Walter gripped her hand tightly, his eyes never leaving their son. "He came back to fight for us, Ellie," he whispered. "Not just for us, but for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves." As Marcus continued his statement, Eleanor noticed a police cruiser slowly driving past Officer Mercer behind the wheel. He made eye contact with her briefly, his expression unreadable before continuing down the street. The confrontation that had begun in a diner was quickly becoming something much larger. Mapleton's carefully maintained facade was cracking, and through those cracks, long-suppressed truths were beginning to emerge. By mid-afternoon, the Johnson family home on Oak Street had become the epicenter of a community in transformation. Eleanor sat on her front porch swing, watching in disbelief as cars lined the normally quiet street. Neighbors who had exchanged nothing more than polite nods for decades now gathered in clusters on her lawn, sharing stories they had kept silent for years. Inside, the living room had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Marcus sat at the dining table with Attorney Washington laptop open between them, methodically organizing witness statements and video evidence. Walter moved among the visitors, his earlier vulnerability replaced by purpose, as he welcomed people into the home he had built with his own hands 43 years ago. "I never thought I'd see this day," Mrs. Gladys Turner, their 80-year-old neighbor, said as she settled beside Eleanor on the swing. "All these years we just kept our heads down, tried not to make waves." Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. "We did what we had to do to survive." "But your boy," Mrs. Turner continued, watching Marcus through the window, "he came back with a different idea." Different indeed. Eleanor was still processing the revelation that Marcus's return had been part of a carefully orchestrated plan months in the making. As a military intelligence officer with specialized training in information gathering and strategic operations, he had applied those skills to a deeply personal mission. His transfer request to Fort Benning as an instructor had been deliberately timed to coincide with the culmination of his evidence gathering. The front door opened as Jamie Chin and Darnell Washington exited, nodding respectfully to the older women on the porch. "Your son is amazing, Mrs. Johnson," Jamie said. "He's integrated our research into his documentation system in hours. What would have taken us months to organize properly?" Darnell added, "And having a decorated officer leading this effort changes everything. People who wouldn't talk to us are coming forward now." As they descended the steps, a black SUV pulled up, and 3 men in Marine Corps uniforms emerged. Eleanor recognized Colonel Harris, Marcus's commanding officer, from previous visits. The other 2 were new to her. "Marcus's colleagues," Walter explained, joining Eleanor on the porch. "He called in some support." The Marines approached with military precision, saluting Walter in recognition of his veteran status before introducing themselves. "Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Johnson," Colonel Harris said warmly, "I apologize for the intrusion. When Marcus informed me of the situation, I thought our presence might be beneficial." Walter shook his hand firmly. "No intrusion at all. Good to see the Corps standing with one of their own." Colonel Harris's expression turned serious. "Sir, the Corps stands with justice. What's happening in this town isn't just a local matter. It represents exactly the kind of systemic issues the military has been working to address within our own ranks and beyond." Inside, Marcus welcomed his colleagues, introducing them to Attorney Washington. Eleanor couldn't hear their conversation, but the purposeful way they gathered around the dining table suggested this was more than a social call. The afternoon brought more surprises. Pastor Mitchell from New Hope Baptist arrived with Reverend Collins from the predominantly white First Methodist, an unprecedented show of unity between churches that had remained segregated despite the passage of time and laws. "The Ministerial Alliance has called an emergency meeting," Pastor Mitchell announced to the gathering. "Every church in Mapleton. We're discussing a joint statement condemning discriminatory policing." Meanwhile, Eleanor's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Former students, colleagues from her teaching days, people she hadn't spoken to in years, called to express support or share their own experiences. By early evening, the impromptu gathering had evolved into something resembling a community forum. Walter had set up folding chairs in the backyard, and Marcus addressed the assembled crowd with the same commanding presence he had shown at the diner. "What happened to my parents today is not isolated," he said, standing on the back porch steps to be visible to everyone. "It's part of a pattern that has gone unchallenged for too long, but patterns can be broken when enough people stand together." He introduced Attorney Washington, who outlined the legal strategies they were pursuing. "We have 3 parallel approaches," she explained. "First, formal complaints with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Second, potential civil litigation against the department and specific officers. Third, community organizing to demand local policy changes and accountability measures." As she spoke, Eleanor noticed a police cruiser driving slowly past their house for the 3rd time that hour. But unlike previous times when such surveillance would have inspired fear today, the community simply noted its presence with knowing glances. The power dynamic had shifted. Inside the house, Eleanor found Marcus in quiet conversation with Officer Mercer, who had arrived in civilian clothes looking nervous but determined. "Mrs. Johnson," he said when he saw her rising quickly to his feet, "I want to apologize for my behavior this morning. It was inexcusable." Eleanor studied the young man who had participated in harassing her husband hours earlier. "Why are you here, Officer Mercer?" He glanced at Marcus before answering. "Because what happened today made me realize I can't keep following orders without questioning whether they're right. I joined the force to help people, not intimidate them." Marcus explained, "Justin has information about departmental practices that could be valuable to our case. He's taking a significant risk by coming forward." Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to forgive, but she recognized the courage it took to break ranks. "What changed your mind?" she asked directly. Mercer looked down. "Seeing the lieutenant colonel stand up to the chief like that, it made me realize I've been hiding behind just following orders for too long. My father was military too. He always taught me that real service means standing up for what's right, not just following the chain of command." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Eleanor went to the window to see Mayor Wilson's car pulling up, the man himself looking distinctly uncomfortable as he navigated through the crowd of citizens gathered on the lawn. "Damage control," Marcus observed, joining her at the window. He's realizing this isn't going away with the usual platitudes. The mayor's arrival coincided with that of several news crews turning his intended private visit into a public statement. Cameras rolled as he stood awkwardly on the Johnsons' front lawn, flanked by citizens whose stories had been ignored for years. "I want to personally assure the Johnson family and all our citizens that we take any allegations of discriminatory policing very seriously." He began, his politician's smile strained. "We'll be conducting a thorough internal review of today's incident." A voice from the crowd called out, "Internal review by who? The same department being complained about." Another added, "We don't need a review, we need accountability." As the mayor struggled to maintain control of the narrative, Marcus stepped outside. The crowd parted naturally, creating a path between him and the mayor. The contrast was striking: the politician in his rumpled suit versus the Marine in his crisp uniform, one representing a system that had failed its citizens, the other embodying the principles that system claimed to uphold. "Mayor Wilson," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the lawn, "I appreciate your concern. However, what's needed isn't another internal review that leads nowhere. What's needed is acknowledgement of the systemic issues and concrete steps toward meaningful change." The mayor blinked rapidly, caught between the cameras and the crowd. "Of course, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. Perhaps we could discuss those steps in a more appropriate setting." Marcus nodded respectfully. "I look forward to that discussion. In the meantime, I believe these citizens would appreciate hearing that you support an independent investigation rather than an internal review." Trapped by his own words and the watching cameras, the mayor conceded, "Yes, of course, an independent investigation would certainly be appropriate given the concerns raised." A small victory, but significant. As darkness fell, Eleanor found herself back on the porch swing. Walter beside her, watching as their home continued to serve as the gathering point for a community finding its voice. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. Walter shook his head slowly. "Not in my lifetime, Ellie. I thought we'd take these stories to our graves like so many before us." They watched as Marcus moved through the crowd, speaking individually, with people ensuring everyone felt heard. "Our boy came home and changed everything in a single day," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just one day," Eleanor corrected gently. "He's been planning this for months, and the change is just beginning." Do you believe that one person standing up for what's right can truly make a difference in challenging systemic racism? Comment number 1, if you think individual courage can spark community change, or comment number 2, if you believe only large movements and policy changes will work. Hit that like button if this story has made you think about how silence enables discrimination in your own community. Subscribe to hear more stories about everyday heroes fighting for justice. The Johnsons have won this battle, but with powerful forces in Mapleton feeling threatened. What challenges might they face next? And will Officer Mercer's decision to break ranks inspire others to speak up? The emergency town council meeting had been hastily scheduled for 7 p.m. Monday evening, less than 36 hours after the incident at Rosie's Diner. The usual venue, a small conference room at City Hall, had been abandoned in favor of the high school gymnasium after it became clear that attendance would far exceed capacity. Eleanor and Walter arrived early, escorted by Marcus and Attorney Washington. They found the parking lot already filling with cars and the entrance flanked by news vans from stations as far away as Atlanta. "Quite the turnout," Walter observed, leaning more heavily on his cane than usual. The stress of the past 2 days had aggravated his knee, though he refused to show any weakness. "The whole town is watching now," Marcus replied carefully, guiding his parents through the growing crowd. "No more handling these issues behind closed doors." Inside the gymnasium had been transformed. Folding chairs faced a hastily assembled stage where the 7 members of the town council sat looking uncomfortable, Mayor Wilson center among them. To their right, a table had been set up for Police Chief Reynolds and 3 other officers, including Officer Mercer, who kept his eyes fixed on the papers before him. To the left, a microphone stand awaited public comments. The Johnsons were directed to seats in the front row directly facing the council. As they settled, Eleanor noticed the clear division in the room. The black residents of Mapleton had claimed one section, many wearing their Sunday best as though attending church. The white residents filled another section, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. But what caught Eleanor's attention were the people deliberately choosing to sit in mixed groups, making a statement with their seating choices. The young couple from the diner, Jamie and Darnell, sat with a diverse group of college-age people. Several church leaders, both black and white, sat together near the front. By 7:15, the gymnasium was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Mayor Wilson called for order, his gavel barely audible over the murmur of hundreds of conversations. "Ladies and gentlemen, this emergency session of the Mapleton Town Council is now in session. We're here to address concerns raised regarding an incident that occurred Sunday morning at Rosie's Diner involving Chief Reynolds Officer Mercer and two of our senior citizens. The deliberate omission of names and racial context was immediately apparent. From the audience, a voice called out, "Say their names." Mayor Walter and Eleanor Johnson were harassed because they're black. Scattered applause followed this correction. The mayor cleared his throat. Yes, well, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, as I was saying, the council has called this meeting to hear from all sides and determine appropriate next steps. Chief Reynolds sat stone-faced, his attorney whispering in his ear. The police union representative beside him looked ready for battle. The mayor continued, "Before we open the floor for public comment, I want to assure everyone that the Mapleton Police Department takes any allegation of misconduct seriously. Chief Reynolds has already initiated an internal review of the incident." Marcus stood immediately. "Mr. Mayor, if I may." Without waiting for permission, he approached the microphone. "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Johnson, United States Marine Corps. I believe we established yesterday that an internal review conducted by the very department under scrutiny would be insufficient. You agreed that an independent investigation was appropriate." The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but proper procedures must be followed. The department has protocols for complaints against officers." Attorney Washington joined Marcus at the microphone. "Mayor Wilson, council members. I'm Ayanna Washington, civil rights attorney representing the Johnson family. Let me be clear, what occurred Sunday was not an isolated incident requiring a simple complaint process. It was part of a documented pattern of civil rights violations that demands comprehensive review." She opened her portfolio and handed documents to the town clerk. "I'm submitting evidence of 73 separate incidents of racial profiling and discriminatory policing by the Mapleton Police Department over the past 24 months. This includes sworn statements from 38 citizens, statistical analysis of traffic stops and arrests showing clear racial disparities, and video documentation of 15 separate incidents." The council members leaned forward to examine the materials being passed among them. Chief Reynolds stood abruptly. "This is a coordinated attack on law enforcement by outside agitators. These so-called incidents are nothing more than routine police work being misconstrued by people with an agenda." His attorney tugged at his sleeve, but Reynolds shook him off. "I've served this town for 34 years. My officers put their lives on the line every day to keep Mapleton safe. And this is the thanks we get. A military man who hasn't lived here in 20 years comes back and stirs up trouble." Marcus remained calm. "Chief Reynolds, I'm not an outside agitator. I'm a son of Mapleton defending my parents and my community against documented abuses of power. And I believe Officer Mercer has something to contribute to this discussion." All eyes turned to Mercer, who looked pale but determined as he stood. The police union representative tried to stop him, but Mercer stepped away from the table and approached the microphone. "My name is Justin Mercer. I've been with the Mapleton Police Department for 8 years. He paused, visibly gathering courage. "What happened at Rosie's Diner on Sunday wasn't an isolated incident. It's standard procedure. We're trained to apply different standards to different neighborhoods. We're encouraged to make example stops of black citizens, especially those perceived as successful or influential." A collective gasp went through the room. Reynolds half rose from his seat, fury evident on his face. "That's a damn lie. Officer Mercer is under investigation for unrelated matters. He's trying to save his own skin." The mayor banged his gavel frantically. "Order. We will maintain order in these proceedings." When the noise subsided, Mercer continued, "I have documentation supporting my statements. Training materials that include racial profiling techniques disguised as community-specific policing, patrol assignments that deliberately target predominantly black neighborhoods, informal quotas for stops and searches that disproportionately affect black residents." He placed a flash drive on the clerk's table. "It's all here. I can't be part of this system anymore." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Reynolds stormed toward Mercer only to find his path blocked by Marcus and two of his Marine colleagues who had positioned themselves strategically. "You're finished, Mercer," Reynolds shouted. "You'll never work in law enforcement again." "That's enough, Chief Reynolds." Mayor Wilson's voice cut through the chaos. "Return to your seat immediately, or you will be removed from these proceedings." For a moment it seemed Reynolds might defy the order, but his attorney pulled him back, whispering urgently in his ear. The next 2 hours saw citizen after citizen approach the microphone, sharing experiences of discrimination and harassment at the hands of Mapleton police. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with the righteous anger of people who had endured too much for too long. White residents came forward too, describing incidents they had witnessed or acknowledging their own complicity through silence. Throughout it all, Eleanor held Walter's hand, drawing strength from his presence as they listened to their community, giving voice to decades of shared trauma. Near the end of the public comment period, Eleanor herself approached the microphone. The room fell silent as the 73-year-old former teacher adjusted the stand to her height. "I taught in Mapleton schools for 35 years, she began, her voice clear and strong. "I taught many of you, or your children, or even your grandchildren. I taught the history of this country, the sanctioned version, and the painful truths behind it. I taught about progress and setbacks, about the long arc that bends toward justice." She looked directly at the council members. "What happened to my husband and me on Sunday was humiliating. But it wasn't surprising, it was simply visible. Most of what we endure happens away from cameras and witnesses, the extra scrutiny at stores, the assumptions about our character, our intelligence, our worth, the constant calculation of risk in everyday interactions." Eleanor paused, looking around the room. "I'm 73 years old. I've spent my life being patient, being understanding, educating rather than accusing. But patience has its limits. Understanding must be mutual, and education requires willing students." Her voice grew stronger. "I will not spend my remaining years pretending that progress will come through silence. My generation was told to wait, to be patient, to trust the system to eventually work. My son's generation is telling us something different, that change comes when we demand it, when we expose injustice to light, when we hold systems accountable." As Eleanor returned to her seat, the applause was deafening. Walter stood to embrace her, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. The council called a 30-minute recess to deliberate. In the hallway outside, Eleanor found herself surrounded by former students, now grown with children and grandchildren of their own. "Mrs. Johnson, you were always our hero," said a woman in her 40s. "But tonight you showed us what courage really looks like." When the council reconvened, Mayor Wilson looked like a man who had aged years in minutes. After consideration of testimony and evidence presented, the council has reached several decisions. First, we will request that the State Bureau of Investigation conduct a thorough review of the Mapleton Police Department's policies and practices. Second, Chief Reynolds will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that investigation. Third, we will establish a citizen oversight committee to review police conduct and provide recommendations for reform. The decisions were met with mixed reactions, applause from many angry, muttering from others. Reynolds stormed out, followed by his attorney and supporters. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus approached his parents. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "The real fight starts now. There will be resistance attempts to undermine the investigation, pressure on witnesses." Walter nodded understanding. "They won't give up power without a struggle." Eleanor looked around at the community that had come together in ways she had never imagined possible. "Neither will we," she said firmly. "Neither will we." The spotlight that had suddenly illuminated the Johnson family exacted an unexpected toll. 4 days after the town council meeting, Eleanor woke with chest pains and difficulty breathing. Walter found her sitting on the edge of their bed, one hand pressed against her sternum, the other gripping the bedpost for support. "Just need a minute," she insisted, but Walter was already calling for Marcus, who had taken up residence in their spare bedroom. Within minutes, Eleanor found herself in an ambulance despite her protests. At Mapleton General Hospital, the attending physician, Dr. Roberts, a former student of Eleanor's, diagnosed stress-induced angina. "Your body is telling you to slow down, Mrs. Johnson," he he said gently. "The events of the past week have put enormous strain on your system." Eleanor was admitted for observation, the private room quickly filling with flowers and cards from community members. Walter refused to leave her side, sleeping awkwardly in the visitor's chair despite his own health issues. Their hospital room became an impromptu command center, with Marcus coordinating with Attorney Washington and others from a small table in the corner. The news of Eleanor's hospitalization spread quickly through town, creating ripples of response that revealed Mapleton's evolving dynamics. Pastor Mitchell organized a prayer vigil outside the hospital that drew over 200 participants, including several white church congregations. The young activists, led by Jamie and Darnell, established a volunteer schedule to bring meals to Walter and run errands for the family. Most surprisingly, a flower arrangement arrived from Tom, the diner manager, with a note apologizing for his inaction during the confrontation. By the second day of Eleanor's hospitalization, the community response had transformed what could have been a setback into a galvanizing moment. From her hospital bed, Eleanor watched the local news coverage with amazement. "They're calling it the Mapleton Movement," she told Walter, pointing to the television, where footage showed diverse groups of citizens gathering at town hall with signs demanding police reform. Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "All these years we thought we were alone in how we felt. Turns out a lot of people were just waiting for someone to speak first." On the evening of Eleanor's third day in the hospital, Dr. Roberts arranged for her to use a conference room for what had become daily strategy meetings. Marcus arrived with Attorney Washington and Officer Mercer, whose decision to break ranks had made him both a pariah among his colleagues and a key witness for the investigation. "The state investigators arrived this morning," Marcus reported. "They've requested department records going back 5 years, patrol assignments, arrest reports, complaint files, everything." Mercer looked exhausted, but determined. "Reynolds is trying to block access to some records, claiming they're part of ongoing investigations, and he's pressuring officers to stand with him. 3 have already signed statements supporting his version of the diner incident." Attorney Washington added, "We've also received reports of intimidation. 2 witnesses who provided statements have had their homes vandalized. Another found his tires slashed." Eleanor sat straighter in her wheelchair, her medical concerns momentarily forgotten. "We can't let fear silence people again. That's how this has continued for so long." Marcus nodded. "I've arranged for security cameras to be installed at the homes of key witnesses. My Marine colleagues are also providing unofficial protection on a volunteer basis." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse announcing a visitor, Stacy from the diner, looking nervous in her street clothes. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, twisting her hands anxiously. "I just wanted to let you know that Tom fired me yesterday. Said I was bad for business because I gave that statement to the investigators." Eleanor reached for the young woman's hand. "I'm so sorry, Stacy. That's not right." Stacy managed a small smile. "Actually, it's okay. Jamie's mother offered me a job at her catering company. Better hours, better pay. I just wanted to tell you that I don't regret speaking up, not for a minute." After Stacy left, Walter turned to Marcus. "This is affecting a lot of people, son. Are we doing enough to protect them?" Marcus's expression was grave. "We're doing everything we can. But you're right. There are costs to standing up that we need to address." The meeting concluded with plans for a community support fund to help those facing economic repercussions for their testimony. Later that night, after everyone had gone and Walter dozed in the chair beside her bed, Eleanor lay awake thinking about the unexpected journey they had embarked upon. What had begun as a simple Sunday breakfast had somehow become a catalyst for change that was reshaping their town in ways she had never imagined possible. The following morning brought news that shook the community. The Johnsons' home had been vandalized during the night, racial slurs spray-painted across the front porch windows, broken, and Walter's carefully tended garden destroyed. Marcus received the call while at the hospital and left immediately, returning 2 hours later with photos documenting the damage. "It's being treated as a hate crime," he reported grimly. State investigators are taking the lead since local police might have conflicts of interest. Walter's hands trembled as he viewed the images of their violated home. 50 years in that house, he said quietly. Raised our son there, planted every tree in that yard. Eleanor felt a surge of anger that overshadowed her health concerns. This is exactly what they want to make us regret speaking up, to make others afraid to join us. She looked at Marcus. I want to go home. Dr. Roberts strongly advised against it, but Eleanor was adamant. By early afternoon, she had been discharged against medical advice, returning to find dozens of community members already at their home, cleaning up the damage, replacing broken windows, and repainting the defaced areas. Eleanor stood leaning on Walter's arm, watching as young and old, black and white, worked side by side to erase the hatred that had been literally painted on their lives. Mrs. Johnson, Jamie called, paintbrush in hand. We saved your garden. The plants were just knocked over, not killed. We've replanted everything. The young interracial couple had become leaders in the community response, their academic research now transformed into practical activism. That evening, as the cleanup crew finally dispersed with promises to return the next day to finish repairs, the Johnsons gathered in their kitchen with Marcus and Attorney Washington. The house felt different somehow, smaller after the intrusion, yet more significant as a symbol. We've received calls from national civil rights organizations, Attorney Washington reported. They're offering resources, legal support, media coverage. This is gaining attention beyond Mapleton. Marcus added, My commanding officer called. The Secretary of the Navy has been briefed on the situation. There's concern about a decorated officer's family being targeted. Walter shook his head in wonder. All this from one Sunday breakfast. The ripples continued to spread. The next day brought news that 3 more officers had come forward with information supporting Mercer's claims about departmental practices. The mayor, sensing the shifting political winds, announced the formation of a police oversight committee, with Eleanor suggested as a potential member. Most significantly, the district attorney initiated a review of past prosecutions involving potentially discriminatory arrests. 1 week after the vandalism, Marcus received an unexpected request. Chief Reynolds wanted to meet privately at his home, away from the department and the media attention. After much discussion, Marcus agreed with Attorney Washington's advice and precautions in place. The meeting, recorded with Reynolds's knowledge, revealed a man whose worldview was crumbling around him. You've destroyed everything I built, Reynolds said bitterly, sitting in his living room surrounded by police commendations and hunting trophies. 34 years serving this town, and now I'm the villain. Marcus remained composed. Chief, you're not the villain because of what my family did. Your own actions brought you to this point. Reynolds scoffed. You come back here with your fancy uniform and outside lawyers, stirring up trouble where there wasn't any. Things worked in this town. Everyone knew their place. That's exactly the problem, Marcus replied. This notion that black citizens should know their place is precisely what needs to change. The law doesn't recognize places based on race. It recognizes citizens with equal rights. The conversation continued for over an hour, Reynolds alternating between defiant self-justification and glimpses of realization that the world he had operated in was disappearing. He made no explicit admissions of wrongdoing, but his attempts to justify departmental practices revealed the systemic nature of the discrimination more clearly than any testimony could have. As Marcus prepared to leave, Reynolds asked, "What happens now?" Marcus paused at the door. Now Mapleton has a chance to become what it always claimed to be, a town where everyone is treated with equal dignity under the law. Whether you're part of that transformation is entirely up to you. The next morning, Eleanor was sitting on their newly repaired front porch when she noticed a car slowly approaching their house. Her heart raced until she recognized Mercer behind the wheel. He parked and approached cautiously, clearly uncertain of his welcome. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, removing his hat. "I wanted to check on you, see if you're feeling better." Eleanor studied the young officer who had stood by while her husband was humiliated, but who had also found the courage to break ranks and speak truth. "I'm improving, thank you. Would you like some iced tea? Walter just made a fresh pitcher." Over tea on the porch, Mercer revealed that he had decided to resign from the force. "I can't be effective there anymore, but I'm not giving up on law enforcement. I've applied to the State Bureau of Investigation. They need officers who understand how discrimination works from the inside." Eleanor nodded. "That takes courage starting over." Mercer looked down at his hands. "My father was so proud when I became an officer. He passed away 3 years ago. I keep thinking about what he'd say now." He paused. "He served in Desert Storm with a mostly black unit. Used to tell me how they saved each other's lives, how color disappeared when bullets were flying. I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." Later that day, Eleanor received a call from her doctor with test results. The stress had indeed affected her heart, requiring medication and lifestyle changes. As Walter helped her organize her new pill regimen, she found herself thinking about time, about how much they had left and how they wanted to spend it. "Walter," she said, as they sat together on the porch that evening, "I think I want to go back to teaching." He looked surprised. "At your age, with your health?" She smiled. "Not full-time, but this whole situation has shown me how much education still needs to happen. The school board is developing a new curriculum on local history. They've asked me to consult, maybe teach some special sessions." Walter considered this, then nodded. "You always were at your best in front of a classroom." He hesitated. "I've been thinking, too. The veterans group at the VA, they want me to lead some discussions about our experiences. Not just Vietnam, but coming home facing discrimination, even in uniform." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "We're not done yet, are we?" Walter shook his head, a new determination in his eyes. "Not by a long shot, by a longs." 6 months later, Mapleton gathered in the town square for what had been officially designated as Community Unity Day. The autumn air carried a crispness that matched the sense of fresh beginning permeating the crowd. Eleanor and Walter Johnson sat in places of honor near the podium where Mayor Wilson ready to deliver a speech that would have been unimaginable half a year earlier. Eleanor surveyed the scene with a sense of wonder. The square had been transformed with booths representing community organizations, local businesses, and educational displays chronicling Mapleton's history, both the sanitized version, long presented in official contexts, and the more complex reality now being acknowledged. Children of all races played together on the lawn while their parents mingled with a newfound ease. Walter squeezed her hand, following her gaze. "Look at that," he said softly, nodding toward a group of teenagers, black and white, gathered around Jamie Chin and Darnell Washington, who were explaining the oral history project they had initiated to document the experiences of Mapleton's oldest residents. "The future right there." Mayor Wilson approached the microphone, looking both older and somehow more authentic than the polished politician who had tried to manage the crisis 6 months before. "Citizens of Mapleton," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "Today we celebrate not just unity, but truth. For too long, our town has lived with a division that we pretended didn't exist. The events that began last spring with the Johnson family have forced us to confront uncomfortable realities about how law enforcement and other institutions have operated in our community." He paused, his gaze finding Eleanor and Walter. "The independent investigation has been completed, and its findings were both disturbing and clarifying. Patterns of discriminatory policing, selective enforcement, and civil rights violations were thoroughly documented. But rather than seeing this as a stain on our community, we have chosen to view it as an opportunity for transformation." The mayor outlined the changes implemented over the past months. The police department had undergone a complete restructuring with new leadership and comprehensive retraining. A civilian oversight board with Eleanor as a founding member now reviewed all complaints of discriminatory treatment. Body cameras were mandatory for all officers, with footage regularly reviewed by the Oversight Committee. Most significantly, the culture of silence that had allowed discrimination to flourish was being systematically dismantled through new reporting mechanisms and whistleblower protections. After the mayor concluded, Marcus Johnson took the podium in his dress blues, the autumn sunlight glinting off his medals. At 39, he carried himself with the quiet authority that had catalyzed Mapleton's transformation, though he consistently redirected credit to the community members who had found their voices. 6 months ago, he began. My parents went to breakfast after church as they had done every Sunday for 20 years. What happened that day revealed not just individual prejudice, but a system that had normalized discrimination to the point of invisibility for those not directly affected by it. He surveyed the crowd. Today, we see the beginning of a new Mapleton, not perfect, not finished, but committed to the ongoing work of justice. Marcus introduced the newly appointed police chief, a black woman with 20 years of experience in community-oriented policing who had been recruited from Atlanta. Next came Justin Mercer, now working with the State Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division, who received a warm round of applause that would have been unthinkable months earlier. As the ceremony continued, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The costs had been real. Her health had required serious attention, though she was stable now with proper medication. Their home had been repaired, but they would never again see it with the same sense of safety they once took for granted. Some friendships had been strained or lost as people chose sides in the community reckoning. Yet the gains were equally tangible. Rosie's Diner, now under new management after Tom had sold the business, displayed a civil rights history exhibit that included the Johnsons' story. The school curriculum now included honest discussions of Mapleton's racial history, with Eleanor herself guest teaching several sessions each semester. Most importantly, the invisible walls that had divided the community for generations were finally being acknowledged and dismantled. When Eleanor's turn came to speak, she rose slowly, still feeling the effects of her health challenges, but determined to stand at the podium rather than speak from her seat. My husband and I have lived in Mapleton for 45 years, she began. We've seen changes come slowly, sometimes painfully. We raised our son here, teaching him to navigate a world that wouldn't always see his worth. She glanced at Marcus standing tall in his uniform. What happened 6 months ago was not new. What was new was that it was seen, acknowledged, and addressed. That is the true meaning of progress, not pretending discrimination doesn't exist, but confronting it honestly when it appears. Eleanor looked out at the faces before her, many familiar from decades of teaching, shopping at the same stores, passing on the same streets without really seeing each other. At 73, I've learned that reconciliation requires truth first. We cannot reconcile what we refuse to acknowledge. Mapleton is beginning that process truly to acknowledge its history, its practices, and the experiences of all its citizens. She turned to where former Chief Reynolds sat at the edge of the crowd. His presence had been unexpected, his decision to attend the ceremony a subject of much speculation. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering, honestly taking responsibility, and committing to a different future. After the ceremony, many lingered in the square enjoying the community celebration that had been organized to follow the formal proceedings. Food trucks offering diverse cuisines lined one side of the square, while local musicians performed on a small stage. Eleanor and Walter found themselves constantly approached by well-wishers, former students, and people wanting to share their own stories of change. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor noticed Marcus in conversation with Jamie Chen and Darnell Washington near the history exhibit. The young couple had become integral to Mapleton's transformation, their academic research providing crucial documentation for the state investigation, while their energy mobilized younger residents. Eleanor made her way toward them, moving carefully with her cane. "They're getting married next spring," Marcus told her as she joined them. "And they've decided to stay in Mapleton." Jamie nodded, her expression determined. "The university offered me a position to continue my research on community policing reforms using Mapleton as a case study, and Darnell's starting a youth advocacy program." "This town still has a long way to go," Darnell added, "but now there's a path forward." As they talked, Eleanor noticed a figure hovering uncertainly nearby, Justin Mercer, looking both official in his State Bureau of Investigation blazer and somehow vulnerable. She motioned him over. "Agent Mercer, congratulations on your new position." He smiled, the tension he'd carried for months somewhat eased. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. It's been a learning curve, but good work. We're implementing some of the reforms developed here in other communities across the state." Marcus extended his hand. "Your testimony was crucial. It couldn't have been easy." Mercer shook his head. "Not compared to what others risked. I just finally decided which side of history I wanted to be on." As the celebration continued, Walter joined them, bringing a surprise visitor, Mrs. Peterson, the elderly white woman from the diner who had been one of the first to speak up after the incident. "Eleanor," she said, her voice quavering slightly with age, "I brought something to show you." She opened a small photo album to reveal a black and white photograph of two young girls, one black, one white, sitting on a school step. "That's us 1956, before they closed the school rather than integrate. We were friends until they told us we couldn't be. I've been wrong for a very long time, staying silent when I should have spoken." The two women, now in their 70s, looked at their childhood selves, separated by decades of enforced distance. Without words, Eleanor embraced Mrs. Peterson, the simple human contact bridging years of artificial division. As evening approached, the Johnsons prepared to return home. The day had been emotionally and physically taxing, especially for Eleanor. Before leaving, they made their way to Rosie's Diner, now renamed Community Table, under its new ownership. It had become their tradition to end significant days with a quiet meal there, reclaiming the space that had been the starting point of their journey. Their usual booth by the window, once denied to them, was always reserved for their visits. As they settled into their seats, Marcus excused himself briefly to take a call outside. Eleanor watched through the window as he paced, his expression serious as he listened to whoever was on the line. "Military business?" Walter asked, following her gaze. Eleanor shook her head. "I don't think so. He mentioned earlier that he's considering his options. His instructor position at Fort Benning was always temporary." Marcus returned, sliding into the booth across from them. "Everything okay, son?" Walter asked. Marcus nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Just confirming some arrangements. I have news, actually. I've been offered a position with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. They're establishing a new task force focused on systemic police reform in small to mid-sized communities. They want me to lead it." Eleanor felt a surge of pride mixed with surprise. "You're leaving the Marines after 20 years. Marcus reached across the table to take both their hands in his. "It's time. What happened here in Mapleton made me realize where my next mission needs to be. The military gave me the skills, the authority, and the perspective to make a difference. Now I need to apply those in communities like ours across the country." Walter studied his son, emotion evident in his eyes. "Your old man couldn't be prouder." Eleanor squeezed Marcus's hand. "There's something I've been wondering, son. That Sunday at the diner. How did you know to come at exactly that moment? You said you had just arrived in town, but it seemed almost too perfectly timed." Marcus smiled, the confident officer giving way momentarily to the boy she had raised. "That wasn't coincidence, Mom. I'd been back for 3 days staying at a hotel in the next town. I had surveillance on Reynolds. I knew his patterns, knew he often harassed black patrons at Rosie's on Sunday mornings. I was watching from across the street, waiting for the right moment to make my presence known." "You used us as bait?" Walter asked, more surprised than angry. Marcus shook his head firmly. "Never. I was monitoring to protect you. I would have intervened immediately if things escalated. But I needed a public incident witnessed by multiple people to break the pattern of denial. When Reynolds targeted you that morning, it created the perfect catalyst, both personal enough for me to have standing and public enough to force acknowledgement." Eleanor considered this revelation. Her military intelligence son had applied his strategic training to their hometown situation, seeing with clarity what needed to happen to break decades of entrenched discrimination. "You came home to fight a different kind of battle," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "The hardest kind, the one within our own community, our own country. The battle for America to live up to its promises to all its citizens." As they finished their meal, Eleanor gazed around the diner, now transformed with its diverse clientele and historical exhibit chronicling Mapleton's journey toward justice. 6 months earlier, she and Walter had entered as second-class citizens, endured humiliation, and found unexpected allies. Today, they were honored community members, part of a town that was painfully imperfectly but genuinely working toward equity. "We should head home," Walter said, noting Eleanor's fatigue. "It's been a long day." Outside, the autumn evening had turned cool stars appearing in the clear sky above Mapleton. As they walked slowly to their car, Eleanor paused to look back at the diner, the town square beyond, and the community that had transformed around them. "Did you ever imagine we'd see this day?" she asked Walter. He shook his head, slipping his arm around her waist. "Not in our lifetime, Ellie. But here we are." Marcus walked slightly ahead, the decorated Marine who had returned home to fight for justice, the son who had transformed his parents' humiliation into a catalyst for change. As they reached their car, Eleanor thought about the journeys that had brought them to this moment. Walter from Vietnam, Marcus from war zones around the world herself, from a segregated childhood to a classroom where she taught generation after generation. Different battles, same war, the long struggle for human dignity. "The work isn't finished," she said as they drove home through the streets of Mapleton. "But it's begun, really begun." What do you think about the power of standing up against injustice, even when it seems impossible to change a system? Comment below with your thoughts on how one family's courage transformed an entire community. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives about real change in America. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that justice is possible when brave people refuse to accept discrimination. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Mapleton. May it inspire all of us to create the change we wish to see in our own communities. This powerful story reminds us that change begins when someone refuses to accept injustice as normal. The Johnson family demonstrated that courage isn't about physical strength or youth, it's about standing firm in your dignity when others try to strip it away. Marcus showed that effective change requires strategy, preparation, and timing. By combining his military training with deep personal commitment, he created a moment that forced an entire community to see what they had long ignored. We learn that systems of discrimination persist not just through active hatred, but through the silence of good people who choose comfort over confrontation. The transformation of Mapleton reveals that reconciliation requires truth. First, we cannot heal what we refuse to acknowledge. Perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us that no one is too old, too vulnerable, or too isolated to spark meaningful change. Eleanor and Walter in their 70s became catalysts for justice, not because they sought that role, but because they refused to surrender their humanity. Their journey reminds us that the path to justice is never complete, but each courageous step forward creates possibilities that didn't exist before. Has there ever been a moment when you witnessed discrimination but stayed silent? What might have changed if someone had stood up like Marcus did for his parents? Comment below with your thoughts on how ordinary citizens can challenge systemic racism in their own communities. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it reach others who need this message of courage and transformation. Subscribe for more powerful narratives that shine a light on America's ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Share this video with someone who might be losing faith that real change is possible. Remember, as Eleanor Johnson taught us, it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Mapleton. May it inspire all of us to find our voice when it matters most.